Montana Territory, 1883. The first thing Franklin Ames saw that morning was a girl sleeping with a pickaxe in her arms, curled up at the edge of his north pasture like she had dropped straight from the sky. It was near dawn, the sun just smudging pink across the low hills. His horse, Dusty, had slowed on his own when he spotted her near the old cottonwood. Franklin narrowed his eyes and nudged the hat back off his brow. The girl was young, maybe 20, her dress caked in dirt and torn at the hem. Her boots were worn straight through at the toes, and her dark hair was tangled around her face. The pickaxe was still clutched in her arms like a child's doll. Franklin dismounted quietly, boots crunching frostbitten grass. She did not stir. "Miss," he said low, not wanting to startle her. "You all right?" Her eyes flew open. She scrambled back, lifting the pickaxe like she meant to swing it. "I ain't gonna hurt you," Franklin said, holding up both hands. "You are on my land, though." She blinked fast, chest heaving. "Is this dry creek?" Franklin tilted his head. "You are standing on it." That made her breath catch. She looked down at the dirt like it held secrets. Then she dropped the pickaxe and sat back hard, eyes glassy. "I found it," she whispered. "I found the place." Franklin crouched a few feet away. "What place?" She looked up at him with something like hope breaking through the exhaustion. "Where he is. The man I told them was buried, but no one believed me." He studied her, unsure whether she was mad, lost, or both. "Who's buried? My brother," she said. "He was left here. And I came to bring him home." Franklin's mouth went still. "You came all this way alone," she nodded. "Name's Nora Nolan. I left Kansas 6 weeks ago." Franklin let out a slow breath. "Well, Miss Nolan, you might not know it, but this land is mostly rock and bones. If you have got a name or a year, I might be able to help you some." Nora's shoulders sagged. "George Nolan. He was with a wagon train in '79. They said he ran off, but I never believed that. I think they buried him after something happened." Franklin remembered the Nolan name. He had heard stories about that doomed wagon train, the one that got caught in a blizzard near the hills. Only a few folks made it to Fort Benton, and none of them spoke much after. "Come on," he said, standing. "I have got coffee and a fire." "You look like you need both." She hesitated, eyes still wary, but her limbs shook when she tried to get up. He held out a hand. She stared at it for a beat, then took it. Back at the ranch house, Nora sat wrapped in a quilt on the porch while Franklin made coffee. She looked out over the pasture like she was still trying to see something buried in it. "How long you been digging?" he asked, handing her the tin cup. "Since yesterday morning. Slept a little around midnight. Dreamt I heard George's voice." Franklin nodded slowly. "You believe he is really there?" "Yes," she said, "even if no one else does." He sat beside her, the porch creaking under his boots. "All right, I will help you look." Nora turned her head, eyes wide. "Why?" he shrugged. "Because you look like you would dig yourself to the bone either way. And I've got a shovel." That was how it started. For 3 days they dug. Franklin guided her toward the hill near the old cottonwood, where the soil was looser. Nora said she remembered George mentioning a tree with a bent trunk and a rock shaped like a boot heel. They found both near the ridge. They dug in the cold, in silence mostly. Nora worked hard, steady, like she had something to prove to the dirt. Franklin watched her when she was not looking, how she wiped sweat from her brow with her sleeve, how she stared at the ground like it owed her something. On the 4th day, Nora's hand hit something solid. She froze, fingers curling around wood. Franklin dropped to his knees and helped clear the dirt. They uncovered a small pine box, aged and rotting at the edges. Nora's lips trembled. "I told them," she whispered. "I told them he did not run." Franklin reached over, resting a hand on her back, firm and warm. "You were right. They buried George proper that evening, up on the ridge where the land caught the sun." Franklin carved a cross from oak and helped her press wildflowers into the dirt. Afterward, Nora stood quiet, arms folded tight over her chest. Franklin looked at her, the way the wind caught her hair, the way her jaw trembled though she tried to keep it still. "You got anywhere to go?" he asked. She shook her head. "No one left. George was all I had." Franklin hesitated. I could use another hand around here. Barn roof needs fixing. Cows do not feed themselves. Nora looked at him, searching his face. You would let me stay? He gave a small nod. As long as you want. She stepped closer. You do not even know me. I know you crossed half the territory with a pickaxe and a promise, he said. That tells me plenty. Nora smiled then, small but real. The next few weeks passed slower, quieter. Nora took to the chores like she had been born to them. She fixed the garden fence, helped with branding, even taught Franklin how to make decent biscuits. At night, they sat on the porch with mugs of coffee, watching the stars blink on. They did not talk about what they were feeling. Franklin was not much for words, and Nora had grown up learning not to trust them. But he started leaving coffee for her in the kitchen before she woke, and she started folding his shirts without asking. One night after the cows had calmed and the sky had turned soft with dusk, Nora stood beside him near the barn. You ever want to leave this place? She asked. He looked out at the land stretching wide around them. Used to, not anymore, she turned to him. Why not? Franklin met her eyes. Because you are here now. Nora's breath caught. She stepped closer, close enough he could see the freckles across her nose, the scar near her temple. I never thought I would find anything out here but a grave, she said. But I found you. He reached for her hand, rough fingers wrapping around hers. I was not looking either, he said, but I am not letting you go. She leaned in then, slow, like she was testing the ground before stepping onto it. He kissed her, gentle and sure, and everything else disappeared. The wind, the dirt, the ghosts of the past, they all went quiet. Only the two of them remained. The first snow came in early November, light and dry, dusting the roof shingles and catching in the corners of windows like sifted flour. Franklin had seen heavier storms come through the high plains, but this one settled in slow, like it meant to stay a while. Nora stood at the edge of the barn, sleeves rolled, red from the cold, watching the flakes slip through the air. Franklin leaned against the stall door, arms crossed. You ever see snow in Kansas? She didn't look away. Not like this. Back home it was slush and mud by noon. This is quieter. You like quiet. I like when it means something. Her voice was low, almost thoughtful, not just silence for the sake of it. He nodded, pushing off the beam. Horses'll need blanketing tonight, storms deepening. She rubbed her hands together. I'll help. They moved together through the barn, checking the latches, laying out extra straw. Franklin handed her the last wool blanket, the one with the stitched edge that had been his father's. She took it without asking. I never knew a man who kept his barn this orderly, she said as they worked. I never knew a woman who knew how to brace a gate with a fence rail without wasting motion. That pulled a grin from her, quick and crooked. George taught me. He said if you're going to fix something, you best fix it so it doesn't break again. Franklin tightened the cinch on the mule's halter. Sounds like he had sense. He did, more than folks gave him credit for. He was quiet too, not stupid, just tired of being misunderstood. Franklin looked up. You're not much like him, she shrugged. He took the weight for both of us. I got left with the fire. The lantern between them flickered as a gust rattled the boards. For a moment neither spoke. Franklin reached for the door. Come inside. Wind'll tear your ears off out here. Inside the house, the fire had burned low in the hearth. Nora knelt to feed it splits of pine while Franklin poured the last of the coffee from the pot. It was strong and bitter, but it kept the cold off the bones. You ever think about what comes next? She asked, her back still to him. I think about what needs doing tomorrow, fixing the south fence, checking the creek bed. Winter's long up here. I meant for you, not the land. He sat on the edge of the table. I've never had much luck thinking past this place. Things come and go, I stay. She turned then, face flushed from the firelight. You ever want more than that? Franklin studied her. Her eyes didn't waver, and her fingers were still smudged with dirt from the barn. I used to think I didn't, he said, but I never had someone worth wanting something with. She didn't drop her gaze. And now, he didn't move, didn't speak for a long beat. Then, now I do. Nora stood, brushing ash from her knees. I don't know how to be someone's future, Franklin. Then don't be. Just be here now. She stepped closer, slow and deliberate. I don't want to be a weight. You're not. His voice was steady. You're the reason the house feels lived in. She reached up, fingertips grazing the edge of his jaw. You sure about that? He caught her hand gently. I've never been more sure of anything. She leaned in, not rushed, just steady, like she was testing the warmth of something long denied. Their foreheads touched first and then, finally, their lips. The fire snapped behind them, the wind howled down the chimney, but none of it mattered. Not the storm, not the past, not the ache they had both carried alone for so long. Later, she sat by the hearth, wrapped in one of the wool blankets. Franklin handed her a plate with bread and dried apple slices. She took it without speaking. You want to sleep in the loft or take the cot by the stove? He asked. She looked up at him, soft-eyed. Neither. He didn't press her. The next morning came with thick white drifts and a sky so pale it nearly vanished into the hills. Franklin found her already outside, breaking ice in the water trough with a hammer. You ever sleep? He asked, voice rough from the cold. She didn't look up. I dreamt. Good dreams. She stood, wiping her hands on her skirt. Not always, but I woke up warm, he nodded. That was enough. They worked the day through, side by side, without needing to speak much. The rhythm of it wood stacked, feed carried, boots crunching over snow was its own kind of language. As the sun began to sink, Nora turned to him. You ever think you were meant to be alone? I used to, he said. But that was before someone came along and dug up more than just bones. She smiled then, quiet and full, and he felt the shift in his chest like something settling into place. They didn't speak again that night, but when he reached for her hand before sleep, she didn't hesitate. By late December, the snow had settled thick across the hills, and the ranch moved slower under its weight. The cattle stayed close to the feed lines, and Franklin paced his days by the sound of thawing water and the creak of ice splitting in the eaves. Nora rose early, same as him, her breath ghosting in the air as she pulled on gloves with stiff fingers and tied her scarf tight against the wind. They spoke less during chores now, not from distance but from ease. They didn't need to fill the quiet. It held them steady. That morning, she wiped her hands on her apron and leaned against the table as Franklin set down a ledger. You always keep books in such clean order. He pulled a pencil from his shirt pocket. Used to matter more, back when I was trying to buy another acre each spring. Still matters, she said. Even if it's just to know where you stand, he glanced at her. You think about numbers often. Back home, I kept the account book for the blacksmith, my uncle. I liked knowing what came in and what went out, didn't like how he spent it. Franklin raised a brow. He treat you poorly. He drank more than he worked. I did what I could to make sure the horses still had shoes and the fire stayed burning. When George left, I stopped asking questions and just kept the doors open. You didn't follow him then, she shook her head. He asked me not to, said the trail west wasn't a place for girls. I listened, but I never stopped regretting it. Franklin closed the ledger. You found him, Nora. That counts for something. She turned toward the stove, her voice lower. It counts for everything, but it doesn't put food in the cellar. He stepped closer. You worried about staying. She didn't move. I've never stayed anywhere I wasn't expected to leave. You think I'd ask you to go. I think maybe you don't know what it means to ask someone to stay. He was quiet a moment. I don't ask things unless I mean them. Nora turned then. All right, then I'll ask something too. What did you want before this place? Before me? Franklin leaned against the counter, arms folded loosely. I wanted to be left alone. I figured peace meant not owing anyone anything. And now, I'm learning peace might be something else entirely. She let that sit between them. Then she reached for her coat. I'm riding to the trading post. We're low on molasses and lamp oil. You need the wagon. I'll take the mare. Saddle's lighter and she moves better through drifts. He watched her pull on her gloves. You need coin. I'll trade the extra jerky we smoked last week, and the pelts from that trapped fox. Franklin nodded. Be back before sundown, snow's turning. She paused at the door. If I'm not, don't come looking. He stepped closer. I will. She didn't argue. The wind had picked up by dusk. Franklin stood on the porch, arms braced against the railing, watching the road curve off between the trees. When hooves finally broke through the stillness, he exhaled and stepped down. Nora's cheeks were red, and ice clung to the hem of her dress. She didn't speak until she'd unsaddled the mare and handed him the parcel wrapped in flannel. They had one bottle of molasses left. I traded for it and a sack of flour. He opened the package in the kitchen, the firelight warming the edges of the waxed paper. How was the road? Frozen deep. But quiet. He poured her a cup of hot water steeped with dried mint. She took it and sat at the table. They asked me if I was your wife. Franklin paused. What did you say? I said I wasn't. And then I asked myself why not. He turned to her then, slow and steady, as if the words needed time to catch their weight. She met his eyes. I don't want to keep half living, Franklin, not when I know what it feels like to be whole. He crossed the room and knelt beside her chair. You sure? I've never been more. He brought her hand to his lips, then stood. I've got no ring, but I've got a roof and land and a fire that never dies out. I don't need a ring, she said, standing with him. I just need you to keep standing beside me. I will. She leaned into him, her head resting beneath his chin. His arms wrapped around her, solid and certain. That night they sat by the fire long after the flames fell low. They spoke of spring planting beans along the southern fence, building a second chicken coop, whitewashing the porch rail. Plans, not dreams. Things with shape and weight. Outside, the wind stilled. Inside, the silence held them, not empty but full. January settled into the valley with a hush, the kind that pressed against the windows and made every sound in the house feel louder. The ranch moved in smaller ways now, shorter days, slower steps, breath rising in clouds. On a morning stitched with frost so fine it laced the inside of the glass, Nora opened the door to find a letter nailed to the fence post. Franklin studied the seal. It's from Fort Benton. Courier must have come through before sunup. Nora turned it over in her hands. No one knows I'm here. He waited while she read. Her eyes scanned quickly, then slowed. She folded the paper twice and set it on the table without speaking. Bad news. It's from an old neighbor. Widow named Cora Hemley. She looked after me when I was little. Says she found something in George's things. A map, said it points to a claim he staked. Franklin leaned forward, thought he never made it past the ridge. He didn't, but he might have sent it back with someone before he died. Her voice dropped. She wants me to come take it. He didn't answer right away. She poured water into the basin and began washing her hands, slow and methodical. I don't know if it's real, she said, and I don't know if I care, but it's his. How far is Hemley's place? Near Helena. 2 days if I ride hard. Franklin stepped back from the stove. You won't ride alone. I wasn't planning to. He passed his hand through his beard, thinking, we'll leave at first light. Saddle the mule, take extra oats. They packed light blankets, dried meat, a tin of salve, and a flask of spruce pitch in case the snow turned sharp. Nora tied her bedroll to Franklin's saddle without a word, and he watched the way she checked each strap twice. They rode out before the sun crested the trees, shadows long behind them. The land opened wide and silent, snow glittering beneath pale sky. They didn't speak much, just the steady rhythm of hooves and the occasional creak of leather. As they camped the first night near a frozen stream, Franklin gathered pine branches for the fire while Nora set the flint. When the flames caught, she sat with her knees drawn up, watching the sparks climb. You ever think about leaving Montana? She asked. He tugged off his gloves and warmed his hands. No need to, it's all I've known. You never wondered if there was more beyond these hills? He shook his head. I've seen enough to know the world out there bites harder than the one here. She was quiet a moment. I used to imagine the coast. Big water, boats with sails. You still want that. I wanted to believe there was somewhere I could go where no one knew me, where I could start without ghosts. Franklin glanced at her. You think this land holds too many of them? She met his eyes. No. This land gave one back to me. They didn't speak again until the fire burned low and the cold pushed them close beneath the blankets. She rested her head against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her without hesitation. By the second afternoon, the road narrowed into a shallow path carved between frozen scrub. Smoke rose in the distance, thin and gray against the white sky. Cora Hemley's cabin stood at the edge of a pine grove, its front porch sagging but swept clean. The old woman opened the door before they knocked. Her hair was white and tied back in a knot, her eyes sharp beneath a knitted shawl. "Well, I'll be," she said. "Didn't think you'd come." Nora stepped forward. "You said there was something of George's." Cora nodded and moved aside. "Come in." "Both of you?" Inside, the air smelled of onions and boiled grain. A kettle hissed softly. Cora led them to a tin box near the hearth, unlatched it, and pulled out a folded sheet wrapped in oilskin. "He sent it with a trapper," she said. "Fella brought it back the winter he was lost. Told me George gave it to him for safekeeping." Nora unwrapped it carefully. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded but legible. It showed a stretch of land marked with a crude line and the word quartz near the ridge they'd dug. Franklin studied it. "Looks like the northern slope." Nora traced the line. "He was prospecting." "He never said a word," Cora said. "He wouldn't have," Nora murmured. "He wanted to prove something first." They stayed the night in the loft above the pantry. In the dark, Franklin spoke low. "You thinking of going back there?" Nora turned toward him. "I think he wanted that claim found, not for money, for proof. You want to dig again," she hesitated. "Not alone." He reached for her hand beneath the quilt, fingers rough against hers. "You won't be." They returned to the ranch 2 days later, weary but quiet with purpose. The next morning, Franklin hitched the wagon and loaded in tools. Nora packed the map, her coat, and a cloth-wrapped biscuit. As she passed through the kitchen, she paused and looked around. "This place doesn't feel like mine yet," she said. "It will," Franklin replied, reaching for her coat. "You've already built half of it." She looked at him, long and steady. "Then let's finish the rest." They found the claim beneath a crust of frozen earth, 2 ridges north of the pasture where George had lain. The map's creased corners lined up with a broken cedar stump and a shallow rise that caught the morning sun just right. Franklin struck the first hole with a post auger, and Nora sifted the turned soil with bare hands, her fingers stiff from cold but steady as ever. By late February, the land began to thaw in patches small, dark circles of exposed ground where the sun lingered. They worked between snowmelt and wind, digging narrow test shafts, hammering at stone, and hauling out samples wrapped in burlap. They did not speak much while they worked, but when dusk came and the tools were packed away, Nora would rest her head against Franklin's shoulder, and he would hold her with the same quiet certainty he used to mend fence rails. One evening, as the creek behind the barn began to run again, Nora crouched over a flat of rock she'd cracked open with a chisel. She held it toward the light. "There's something in this one," she said, brushing away the dust. Franklin knelt beside her. "Vein," she nodded slowly. "Thin, but it's there." He turned the rock in his hand, the faint shimmer catching at the edges. "You think it's what George found. I think he left it behind for a reason." Franklin tilted his head. "You want to file a claim?" Nora looked at the ridge behind them. "I'm not after silver. I'm after a place with meaning. You've got that here." She looked at him, her face open in a way it hadn't been in months. "I know." The next day, they buried the map beneath the cedar stump, wrapped in oilskin again. Nora didn't want to keep it hung on a wall or folded in a drawer. It had served its purpose. Some things, she said, belonged to the earth again once they'd been heard. March brought with it a different kind of wind, not sharp, but carrying the scent of thawing pine and wet bark. Franklin built a new addition to the barn, hammering through afternoons while Nora worked in the soil near the house, turning over ground for spring planting. She planted cabbage, then half a row of onions. He watched her sometimes from the porch, the way she leaned into the work like it answered something inside her. One afternoon, while he mended gate hinges, she came to him with a folded cloth in her arms. "I've been sewing evenings. Figured it was time." She held it out. Inside was a shirt cotton, pale blue, the stitching uneven but solid. He ran his hand over the seams. "You made this. I wanted to give you something that lasts more than a season." He smiled, quiet and full. "Then I'll wear it until it wears through." She stepped closer, her fingers brushing his wrist. "Franklin." "Yeah, I don't want to talk about leaving anymore, not ever." He set down the hammer and looked at her, slow and sure. "Then let's talk about staying, you and me." She nodded. "I want vows, not in a church, just something that belongs to us." He reached for her hand. "By the ridge, then, where the snow first melted." They married beneath the cedar stump with the wind in the trees and the land around them softening under spring. Franklin wore the shirt she'd sewn. Nora wore her mother's brooch pinned to her collar. No preacher, just their own words spoken in low voices, promises made without grandness, but with all the weight of the lives they'd carried. After they shared coffee by the fire as dusk settled, the world outside cradled in gold. Franklin lifted her hand to his lips. "You gave me a life I didn't know to want." She rested her head against his chest, listening to the low thrum of his heart. "You gave me a place that finally felt like mine." They never dug again at the claim site. Nora planted wildflowers across the ridge that summer. Franklin built her a bench there with carved initials beneath the seat. They watched storms roll in from the porch and counted the time in harvests and thawed creeks, not in days. Years passed. The barn saw new coats of paint. The garden stretched wider. And in time, a cradle rocked in the parlor beside the fire, where a baby boy slept with Nora's nose and Franklin's steady eyes. They named him George. Franklin carried him across the pasture one morning in late spring, pointing out the ridgeline, the cottonwood, the creek that never ran dry. Nora leaned in the doorway, watching father and son framed against the land that had held grief and love and everything in between. She smiled, the kind that knew the weight of sorrow but chose joy anyway. And inside the house, the fire never burned out.